The Brazilian president, Jair Bolsonaro, is basically blaming NGOs for the fires in the Amazon. Our next guest, Andrew Miller, is the advocacy director for one such NGO, Amazon Watch, and he joins me now. Andrew, thanks very much for being on the show. I've been speaking a lot for quite a bit with your colleague Christian, in fact, for hours on end about the Amazon. And I want to first draw our viewers' attention to a tweet from Amazon Watch in the last 41 seconds. If we can bring, I'm just going to get my producer to bring up the map. It's a map that Amazon Watch have tweeted, said, we made this map to show how Amazon fire hotspots in the Amazon rainforest overlap with protected areas and or indigenous territories. Indigenous peoples are the best protectors of the rainforest. They're also the most at risk from its destruction. Let's stand with them. Talk to us about exactly what we're seeing here.
So in this map, it shows the Amazon, which of course is not just Brazil, but there's also you have the other countries in the Amazon basin that are seeing fires too, in Peru and Bolivia and elsewhere. But this map is very interesting because you can actually see where the indigenous territories are. And when you look at the Amazon from a satellite, you can also see, in many cases, where the indigenous territories are. Outside of those territories, it's deforested. And right within those territories, that's where you find the forests. So the indigenous
the yellow parts are the protected areas and or indigenous territories. The red dots you're seeing on your screen, Andrew, I'm just telling our viewers, are hotspots of fire locations for the last 7 days, correct?
Yes, and in the last week, there have been 10,000 fires that have been set. And again, as some of the previous commentators have mentioned, this isn't simply because it's too dry or simply because there are lightning strikes. This is because these are fires that are being deliberately set. And in many cases, because farmers feel emboldened by the extremist right-wing president, Jair Bolsonaro, who in policy and in rhetoric has been encouraging further development, what they call development of the Amazon, in many cases within indigenous territories or within protected areas, and this is having catastrophic effects. Not just the fires, but also the rates of deforestation are spiking. And the Brazilian Space Agency has been documenting this very well. Jair Bolsonaro, in a very similar vein to something that Donald Trump would say, has been calling it fake news, essentially, has been calling into question the scientific facts and taking measures, for example, firing the head of the space agency, et cetera, to try to control the flow of information outside of Brazil.
I mean, he is known as Trumpinho, as small Trump, because obviously some of his rhetoric that we've heard from him. He's also blamed NGOs for the fires. What's your response to this, Andrew?
Well, we don't really have much of a response because it's such an absurd claim. These fires happen. This is the burning season. These fires happen every year at this time. It's just that they're up almost double this year over last year. And again, this is a result of the policies that Jair Bolsonaro is putting in place, slashing enforcement of existing laws, attempting to change the laws to weaken the protections of indigenous territories and protected areas, of placing climate deniers and environmental criminals as ministers within his government. So that's on the policy side. On the rhetoric side, of course, Jair Bolsonaro has had a very anti-indigenous rhetoric, has been saying that the deforestation is fake news, and then, of course, the most recent news about him ostensibly blaming the NGOs. That's something that is simply said in order to drive media cycles. It's something that perhaps plays well with certain members of his base, but has zero basis in evidence.
You know, I speak Portuguese, I'm Portuguese, and I do follow his Twitter and see what he says in Brazilian press. And I was gobsmacked, in fact, Andrew, when he said not so long ago that he thought that the indigenous people had too much land, really, that really they should be integrated into, they wanted to be integrated into society. How do you interpret this? How is this being interpreted by those also who have financial interests and see opportunity in these lands that he thinks should no longer be demarcated?
Well, obviously, I mean, Jair Bolsonaro represents the ruralista agribusiness bloc, and every action he's taking is in their interests. the discourse about indigenous territories and indigenous peoples having too much land is one that we've heard in Brazil and we've heard in many places around the world. But indigenous peoples want to protect their territories. They want to expand their territories in certain cases, and they're really stepping up. Just last week, we had thousands of indigenous women who are protesting in Brasilia, and we have many cases around the Brazilian Amazon where indigenous peoples are organizing forest guards, and they're actively going out and confronting illegal loggers, confronting illegal miners, and they do this at incredible risk to themselves. And we're seeing cases of indigenous leaders who are being killed and who are receiving death threats. Brazil, of course, being one of the most dangerous places in the world to stand up on behalf of the environment. So this is a moment where indigenous peoples, they're standing up and they're risking their lives to do so. So it's important that international civil society stands in solidarity with indigenous peoples, calls out what's going on with this government. It's also important to recognize that we as international consumers are playing a role here too, in terms of creating the markets for the beef, creating the markets for the soy. And so we as consumers need to recognize our role as shareholders in companies that are invested in Brazil, and as voters too, in countries like the United States or in Europe, where Brazil is attempting to establish free trade agreements. And we wrote last week that a Trump-Bolsonaro free trade agreement is an apocalyptically bad idea, given what we're seeing in the Amazon right now.
You're spot on. I mean, some would argue the big finance are, in fact, emboldening Bolsonaro, and that's all his intention all along, but we all play a part. Andrew Miller from Amazon Watch, I appreciate you taking time to speak to us here on CNN.
Thank you.